The first tree fell without warning. Not burned, not struck, just pushed over by wind that had been building for hours while Aaron Hale told himself he still had time. The tower shuddered once, then steadied. The radio hissed. The road below vanished behind moving walls of dust and branches. He could still leave, maybe. But every minute he waited, the mountain tightened its grip. And when the second tree crashed across the only way down, he understood the truth. He wasn't watching the ridge anymore. The ridge was closing in on him. October 18th, 1983. Mendocino National Forest, Northern California. The Santa Ana winds were not supposed to reach this far north with this kind of force, but by late afternoon the ridge no longer followed forecasts. Aaron Hale stood inside the narrow glass cabin of Firewatch Tower 17, 5,200 feet above sea level, logging wind speed by hand because the anemometer needle was trembling too violently to trust. The sky remained painfully clear. A sharp blue stretched over miles of dry timber. Yet the air felt wrong, too fast, too dry, pressing against the structure as if testing it. Below him, the dirt service road coiled down the mountain in pale switchbacks, still visible, still open, though dust had begun to lift from it in low, restless spirals. The first impact came from the western slope, a deep cracking sound followed by a violent shudder that ran through the tower's steel legs and up into Aaron's boots. He froze, listening, counting seconds, until a second crash answered from farther down the ridge. Trees were not snapping from fire, not exploding from lightning, but folding under sustained wind that had been building quietly for hours. He stepped to the radio, pressed transmit, and called the ranger station twice. The reply came thin, broken by static, the dispatcher's voice clipped by interference. Winds increasing, recommend early descent. The sentence dissolved before it finished. Aaron looked again at the road, calculating distance, time, risk. 25 minutes to reach his truck if he left now. Maybe less. He hesitated, and that hesitation stretched longer than it should have. Protocol demanded one final horizon scan before abandoning post. He lifted the binoculars and swept the eastern valleys, searching for smoke that could turn a bad wind into a catastrophe. Nothing. Just endless movement. Treetops bending in synchronized waves like something breathing below them. Another violent gust slammed into the tower, rattling the window frames hard enough to make the glass vibrate in its casing. The structure groaned, metal flexing but not failing. Aaron swallowed and checked the fuel level on the small backup generator. Enough for a few hours. Not enough for comfort. When the second tree fell across the lower section of the road, he saw it happen. A massive pine tilted slowly, almost gently, then dropped sideways, dragging branches with it and sending a cloud of dust and splintered wood into the air. The switchback beneath it vanished. Aaron's chest tightened. One obstruction he could clear with the chainsaw stored below. Two, maybe. But as he watched, smaller trees along the ridge began to lean in the same direction, roots lifting in patches of dry soil that had not seen rain in months. The wind was no longer passing through. It was settling in. He grabbed his field pack, shut down the main power, and opened the tower hatch. The ladder swayed before he even touched it. Halfway down, another crash echoed from below, closer this time, followed by the sharp metallic snap of something under strain. He glanced toward the road again and felt the decision close around him. The mountain was rearranging itself faster than he could descend it, and for the first time since taking this post, Aaron understood that leaving might no longer be the safest choice. Aaron climbed back into the cabin instead of continuing down, pulling the hatch shut with more force than necessary, as if sealing it might steady the structure. The tower swayed in long, uneven motions now. Not sharp jolts, but deep shifts that traveled through the steel frame and into his ribs. He moved quickly, not panicked, but precise, securing loose binders, locking the cabinet doors, strapping the field radio to the desk so it would not crash to the floor. The wind outside had changed pitch, lower and more constant, a sustained pressure that no longer arrived in gusts but held the ridge in a firm, unbroken grip. Somewhere below, branches scraped across metal, a harsh grinding sound that suggested the lower stair supports were already under stress. He tried the radio again, adjusting the antenna angle by inches, speaking slowly to conserve clarity. Tower 17 to base. Road partially blocked, wind exceeding forecast, requesting status. Static answered first, then a fractured voice, not the dispatcher this time, but another lookout from a southern ridge. Lost 2 lines, visibility dropping, stay put if descent unsafe. The transmission cut cleanly, as if severed. Aaron stared at the speaker, waiting for the carrier signal to return, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the wind. He understood then that communication was thinning across the entire forest, not just at his elevation. He forced himself to think in steps instead of outcomes. Inventory. 1 case of bottled water, 4 emergency ration packs, a first aid kit, 1 portable chainsaw, fuel half full. Backup batteries for the handheld radio, though useless without signal. The generator hummed unevenly beneath the floor, vibrating slightly off rhythm, and Aaron knelt to check the housing. Dust had begun to push through the seams in fine streams, carried upward by the pressure outside. He wiped it away with his sleeve and tightened the intake cover, aware that every small failure would multiply if ignored. The tower lurched suddenly to the east, hard enough to throw him against the wall. Glass rattled violently in its frame, and for a second he imagined it giving way, shattering inward under the force. Instead, it held, but another crash erupted from the slope below, closer, followed by the unmistakable tearing sound of metal under torque. Aaron moved to the west-facing window and felt his breath shorten. A section of the lower stair assembly had twisted, 1 support beam bent at a sharp angle where a fallen trunk had struck it. The ladder was still intact, but its alignment had shifted. Descending now would mean stepping onto a structure already compromised. Dusk began to settle without color, the sky bleaching from blue to a flat, dusty gray. The wind did not slow. It deepened. The ridge below was no longer clearly visible. Movement blurred the edges of everything, branches whipping in erratic patterns, smaller trees folding and rising like something alive. Aaron understood with cold clarity that the road was no longer a reliable escape even if he reached it. The mountain was not erupting into disaster. It was tightening, slowly, methodically, closing exits one by one, while giving no single moment dramatic enough to justify panic. He checked his watch and marked the time in his logbook with a steadier hand than he felt. If he left now, he might still reach the truck. If he stayed, he might outlast the worst of it. Both choices carried risk, but as another tremor rolled through the tower's legs and the sound of splitting timber echoed upward like distant thunder, Aaron began to suspect that the decision was no longer entirely his to make. Night did not fall. It sealed the ridge in darkness so complete that the windows became black mirrors, reflecting only Aaron's own movements back at him. The wind no longer arrived in gusts. It pressed continuously, a heavy lateral force that made the tower lean and hold before snapping partway upright again. Each sway felt slower, deeper, more deliberate. The generator sputtered beneath the floor, lights dimming hard enough to thin the room into shadow before recovering. Aaron crouched beside it, listening not for sound, but for rhythm. The vibration had changed. The tower was no longer flexing safely. It was absorbing strain. A sudden impact from below exploded upward through the steel legs. The entire structure jolted sideways so violently that Aaron slammed into the wall. For 1 suspended second, the tower did not return to center. It held at an angle that made gravity feel uncertain. Somewhere beneath him, metal tore with a long, grinding scream. He forced open the hatch and aimed his flashlight down into chaos. One of the primary stair supports had twisted nearly free of its anchor plate. The lower platform hung crooked, railing half ripped away, debris scattered across the slope. The stairs were no longer a descent. They were a hazard waiting to detach. He shut the hatch and locked it. Leaving now meant stepping onto compromised steel in total darkness while the entire structure swayed under sustained wind. Staying meant trusting 4 aging legs bolted into dry soil that had not seen rain in months. The radio erupted suddenly in a burst of static that cut through the roar. A fragment of voice broke through. Multiple towers compromised, evacuations delayed. Then nothing. No carrier signal. No repeat. Aaron stared at the speaker until the silence felt heavier than the storm. Another gust struck harder than any before it. The west window fractured fully this time, a spiderweb of cracks racing across the glass. Dust blasted inward in fine streams, stinging his face, coating the desk. The tower leaned again, farther, long enough for loose equipment to slide across the floor. Aaron dropped low instinctively, spreading his weight near the center of the cabin, calculating balance without thinking. If one leg failed, the structure would not collapse slowly. It would shear and drop. The wind did not weaken. It deepened, a continuous roar that erased distance and direction. Aaron pressed his palm against the vibrating floor and felt the sustained torque in the steel below. The mountain was no longer striking and retreating. It was pushing and holding. There would be no descent tonight. And as the tower groaned again, longer, lower, almost organic, he understood that survival no longer depended on timing. It depended on whether the structure beneath him could endure one more hour. The first structural failure did not announce itself with collapse, but with a shift so subtle, Aaron almost doubted it. The floor beneath him dipped half an inch to the west and held there. Not a sway. A new position. The tower had settled. He felt it in his knees before he saw it in the window frames, the horizon line now angled slightly wrong. The wind roared without pause, driving against the structure in a single relentless direction, and the steel legs answered with a low vibration that no longer reset between gusts. This was sustained load, continuous torque, the kind that weakens metal without spectacle. Another violent strike hit the base, closer than the others. The impact rattled through the cabin like a hammer blow. Aaron lunged to the east window and caught sight of movement below. A large pine, uprooted, had slid downslope and wedged against one of the tower's main supports. It had not knocked the leg free, but it had changed the angle of pressure. The tree was now acting like a lever, wind pushing against its mass and transferring force directly into the steel frame. Each gust amplified the strain. The tower groaned deeper, the sound drawn out and uneven. He moved fast now, not in panic, but in calculation. If the leg failed, the west side would drop first. He dragged the desk toward the eastern wall, redistributed weight, secured the remaining intact windows with tape and straps from the emergency kit. The cracked pane flexed under pressure, glass trembling in its frame like something alive. Dust poured through seams in thin gray sheets. The generator coughed again, lights dimming hard enough to plunge half the room into shadow before sputtering back. He checked the fuel gauge. Lower than it should have been. Running the generator through the night might not be an option. The tower leaned again, farther this time, and did not fully recover. Aaron felt the tilt in his balance, gravity subtly altered. He dropped to his stomach and pressed his ear to the floor. Beneath the wind he heard it clearly now. A metallic ticking, irregular, sharp. Bolts shifting under stress. Expanding, straining. He pictured the anchor plates embedded in dry, fractured soil, soil that could shear without warning. If one anchor pulled free, the entire structure would rotate around the remaining legs. A sound erupted below that froze him completely. Not wood, not wind, but a sharp metallic snap, followed by a violent shudder that ran upward through every beam. The tower jerked sideways and held there for a long, impossible second. Aaron's hands flattened against the floor instinctively as loose equipment slid toward the lower corner of the room. The pine wedged against the leg had shifted. The pressure had changed again. And in that suspended moment, with the entire structure tilted farther than it had any right to be, Aaron understood something terrifyingly simple. The tower was no longer resisting the storm. It was negotiating with it. And the negotiation was almost over. The snap below did not repeat, and that silence was worse than another impact. The tower remained tilted, not dramatically, but enough that Aaron had to brace one hand against the wall to stay balanced. The pine wedged against the western leg had shifted again, now angled upward, its trunk vibrating under sustained wind like a loaded spring. Each gust drove it harder into the steel support, turning the fallen tree into a battering ram that never pulled back. The metallic ticking beneath the floor grew faster, sharper, irregular. Something below was giving in fractions. Aaron moved deliberately toward the center of the cabin and began stripping weight from the western side, tossing water cases and loose equipment toward the east corner to rebalance the structure. It was instinct more than certainty. If the compromised leg failed, redistribution might delay a full rotational collapse by seconds, maybe longer. Seconds mattered. He cut the generator power to reduce vibration and conserve fuel. The lights died instantly, leaving only the beam of his flashlight slicing through dust-thick air. The sudden darkness magnified every sound. Wind grinding against steel, wood splintering below, bolts clicking under strain. Another sustained push hit from the north, not a gust, but a steady shove that made the entire tower lean farther than before. Aaron felt his boots slide slightly across the floor. The pine below shifted again with a violent crack, bark tearing as it twisted against the leg. The metallic ticking stopped for one breathless moment. Then came a deep, resonant groan from beneath him, longer than any before, a structural complaint traveling upward through every joint and beam. He dropped flat against the floor, spreading his weight instinctively, heart hammering against the steel beneath his chest. The tower lurched abruptly and rotated a few degrees farther west. Equipment skidded across the cabin. One of the eastern windows bowed inward under pressure, frame flexing audibly. The support below had not snapped, not yet, but it had bent. The entire structure now rested on altered geometry, weight distributed unevenly across 3 stable legs and 1 compromised anchor. If that leg folded completely, the tower would pivot violently downslope. Aaron crawled toward the hatch again, not to descend, but to assess. He forced it open against the wind and angled the flashlight downward. The sight stole the air from his lungs. The western leg had shifted several inches out of plumb, base plate partially torn from its concrete footing. The pine pressed hard against it, trunk grinding in constant motion. Soil around the anchor bolts had cracked and lifted. One more sustained push might rip it free entirely. He closed the hatch slowly this time. There would be no climbing down. There would be no riding this out casually. The storm was no longer testing the tower. It was dismantling it piece by piece. And as another relentless surge of wind drove into the ridge, Aaron understood that the next movement might not be a tilt. It might be the moment the mountain finally decided to take the tower with it. The next surge did not feel like wind. It felt like weight, a continuous force that leaned into the tower and refused to release. The structure shifted again, farther west, and this time it did not recover even partially. Aaron felt the new angle settle into the floor beneath him, gravity subtly wrong, equipment slowly sliding until it struck the eastern wall. The compromised leg below screamed under strain, a high metallic whine layered beneath the deeper groan of bending steel. The pine trunk pressed harder, bark shredding as it vibrated, each second grinding the anchor plate deeper into fractured soil. Then came the sound he had been waiting for and dreading. Not a snap, but a ripping tear of metal pulling free. The tower dropped several inches in one violent motion. Aaron was thrown sideways, his shoulders slamming against the cabinet. The flashlight skidded across the floor, beams spinning wildly before striking the ceiling. For a suspended second, the entire structure tilted at an angle so severe he thought it was already falling. Outside, debris cascaded downslope in a rolling crash of branches and splintered wood. The western leg had not fully sheared. but one of its anchor bolts had torn loose. The base plate now twisted visibly beneath the floorboards, weight redistributed abruptly across the remaining supports. The pine trunk shifted downward with a heavy thud, partially relieving pressure but destabilizing the geometry further. The tower was no longer upright. It was braced in tension, held by steel that was not designed for this angle. Another sustained shove would not bend it. It would rotate it. Aaron crawled toward the eastern wall, pressing himself low, breathing through dust-filled air. He understood something critical in that moment. If the tower collapsed completely, it would fall west, downslope, dragged by the failing leg and the leverage of the pine. The eastern side would rise first before dropping violently. If he stayed centered, he would be thrown. If he moved east, he might buy himself space before impact. It was not a perfect calculation. It was survival math. Another push struck, stronger than the last. The tower lifted slightly on the east side, just enough for loose debris to slide back toward the west wall. Aaron felt the lift through his ribs as he flattened himself against the eastern corner, gripping the bolted frame of the window. The entire structure trembled violently, metal shrieking as torque exceeded design. For a fraction of a second, the wind seemed to pause, not in silence, but in balance. Then the ground beneath the western leg shifted. Soil gave way with a dull, heavy collapse. The tower rotated sharply downslope, not fully falling, but dropping enough to slam the cabin floor at a steeper angle. Glass shattered inward from the already fractured pane, spraying the room with fragments. Aaron clung to the frame, heart hammering, knowing with cold certainty that the structure had reached its limit. One more major shift would not be another tilt. It would be the fall. The tower did not fall immediately. It held at a brutal angle, tilted far enough that standing was impossible. Aaron pressed himself into the eastern corner, fingers locked around the steel window frame as the entire structure groaned beneath him. The western leg had sunk deep into fractured soil, and now the tower rested in a twisted balance, not upright, not collapsed, suspended between failure and endurance. Wind slammed continuously against the exposed side, each strike forcing the steel to scream in protest. Glass fragments slid slowly across the floor toward the west wall, ticking softly as they gathered against the tilt. Another violent surge drove the pine trunk harder against the compromised support. The vibration changed instantly. Not random shaking, a steady oscillation that matched the wind's rhythm. Aaron felt it through his ribs. Resonance. The structure was beginning to move in sync with the force pushing it. That was worse than impact. Sustained oscillation would fatigue the remaining anchors faster than brute force ever could. He crawled lower, flattening himself, spreading his weight, as another deep metallic crack echoed from below. Something else had bent. The eastern legs now carried most of the load, but they were not designed for lateral stress at this angle. Aaron knew the math without seeing it. One anchor had already torn free. Another would not hold long under compounded torque. The floor shifted again, not a drop this time, but a slow, rotational slide. The tower was creeping downslope by inches. He could feel it. The cabin frame scraped faintly somewhere beneath him, metal grinding against distorted joints. The wind intensified without pause. There were no gaps now. No cycles, just relentless pressure. The pine trunk finally snapped near its midpoint with a sharp, explosive crack. For a heartbeat, Aaron thought the pressure might release. But instead, the broken section shifted downward, dragging against the leg and jerking the entire tower violently west. The cabin lurched hard enough to lift him momentarily off the floor before slamming him back down. One of the eastern windows bowed outward under strain, screws whining in their mounts. Then came the sound that erased all doubt, a heavy, tearing rip from below, followed by a deep, grinding collapse of soil giving way. The western base had fully surrendered. The tower dropped another several degrees, the cabin now at a severe angle that made breathing feel unnatural. Aaron's grip tightened as the structure trembled violently, balanced on the last anchors that still held. The storm was no longer negotiating. It was counting down. The tower was no longer standing. It was hanging. The western side had dropped so far that the floor felt like a steep ramp, forcing Aaron to brace both boots against the eastern wall to keep from sliding. The last two stable legs groaned under impossible strain, steel bending in slow protest. Every gust now produced a shudder that rippled through the entire frame. The cabin creaked with each micro-shift, bolts grinding against distorted anchor plates. The structure had moved several feet downslope, carving shallow trenches where the bases had dragged through soil. Aaron could feel the anchors loosening one by one, not snapping, but shifting. The east-facing window frame began to warp, screws backing out a fraction at a time under torsion. He flattened himself low again, pressing his weight toward the highest corner, calculating the fall line. If the tower fully rotated, it would not drop straight down. It would roll west, striking the slope in stages. Impact would be uneven. The first collision would crush the lower wall. The second would fold the roof. He needed to avoid being pinned beneath collapsing steel. Another surge slammed into the ridge, stronger than the rest. The remaining western anchor tore free with a deep metallic rip. The entire tower rotated violently, dropping several feet in a sudden, sickening plunge before catching again on the eastern legs. The jolt hurled Aaron sideways. He struck the wall hard, air forced from his lungs, vision flashing white. Outside, the broken pine trunk slid clear of the structure, removing the last brace that had been distorting the geometry. Now nothing held the western side back. The oscillation grew worse. Without the pine wedged beneath it, the tower began to sway at a dangerous angle, pivoting around the overstressed eastern supports. The floor flexed beneath Aaron's palms. He could feel metal giving in increments too small to see but too large to ignore. Each movement was slightly larger than the last. The structure was no longer resisting. It was preparing to fail completely. Then came the final shift in balance. One eastern anchor plate sheared halfway loose, a sharp crack cutting through the roar. The tower dropped again, this time not inches but a full, uncontrolled rotation that tore the remaining leg from the soil. The world tilted violently as the cabin rolled westward, steel shrieking, glass exploding outward. Aaron clung to the interior frame as gravity inverted around him, knowing with absolute clarity that the tower had finally lost the fight, and that the fall had begun. The wrecked tower did not slide any farther, but it did not settle either. It hung against the young pines at a steep angle, steel frame twisted and embedded into the slope like a broken spear. Aaron lay flat against the dirt a few feet from the wreckage, chest pressed to cold soil, fingers dug into loose ground to keep from sliding. The wind tore across the ridge without pause, ripping at his jacket, forcing grit into his eyes. The slope beneath him felt unstable, shifting in subtle waves each time a gust pushed through the trees. He realized quickly that the collapse had changed more than his position. It had destabilized the hillside itself. He tried to stand and nearly slid 10 feet before catching himself on a root. The ground was layered in dry soil and pine needles that had never been meant to carry sudden weight from falling steel. Each movement triggered minor slides, dirt cascading quietly downward into darkness. If he descended recklessly, the slope could take him with it. If he climbed back toward the wreckage, the twisted frame might shift again. Above him, the broken tower creaked violently with every surge of wind, scraping against the bent trunks that held it in place. Those trees were bowing lower each minute. Pain flared sharply in his right leg when he shifted weight onto it. Not broken, but compromised. Every step would cost him. The night around him felt enormous, horizon erased, direction reduced to wind and incline. There was no visible road, no visible trail, no clear orientation beyond gravity. His radio was gone, crushed inside the debris. His pack had disappeared somewhere in the fall. He had no light beyond the weak beam of a cracked flashlight that flickered whenever he shook it. The ridge that had once been familiar ground was now a blind slope of unstable earth. Another violent blast tore through the trees. One of the young pines holding the wreckage snapped with a sharp report. The broken tower shifted several inches downward, grinding against rock. Aaron froze, heart pounding. If the remaining tree failed, the steel mass would come sliding straight toward him. He crawled sideways across the incline, desperate to clear the fall line, fingers clawing at dirt that refused to hold. The wind did not weaken. It intensified, as if the storm had sensed movement. He stopped only when his arms began to tremble uncontrollably. He was stranded halfway down a steep, shifting mountainside in sustained hurricane-force wind. Injured, without gear, without radio, without shelter. The tower was destroyed. The road was gone. The night was long. And for the first time since the storm began, Aaron understood something that cut deeper than fear. Even if the wind stopped right now, there was no clear path back up and no clear way down. He was not waiting out the storm anymore. He was inside it, exposed and completely alone. The wind did not stop when dawn came. It thinned slightly, losing its violent edge, but it never released the ridge completely. Aaron had not slept. He had spent the night pressed against the slope, shifting inches at a time to avoid sliding soil and falling debris from the broken tower above. When the sky began to pale from black to cold gray, he finally saw the shape of the mountain around him, steep, scarred, unstable. The wreckage hung 20 yards upslope, twisted beyond recognition. Below him stretched a long descent through loose dirt and shattered branches. Climbing back was impossible. Waiting meant exposure. The only direction left was down. He began moving carefully, testing each step before committing weight. His injured leg protested immediately, sharp pain radiating upward with every controlled slide. He did not walk so much as descend in angled crawls, using roots and embedded rocks as anchors. Twice the soil beneath him gave way and carried him several feet before he caught himself. The mountain had been stripped by the storm. Trees lay uprooted across the slope, their root systems torn open like shallow craters. Each obstacle forced him to detour, costing energy he did not have. By mid-morning, the wind weakened further, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt unnatural after hours of roar. Without the noise, exhaustion flooded in. His hands were raw from gripping rock and bark. His right leg trembled with every shift in weight. He paused only when he reached a narrow drainage cut into the hillside, using it as a channel to descend more safely. The soil here was compacted by runoff, firmer under his boots. For the first time since the collapse, he felt something close to control. Then he saw it. Not clearly at first, just a break in the tree line below that did not belong to nature. A pale strip cutting across the lower slope. He blinked hard, unsure whether exhaustion was distorting distance. But as he descended farther, the shape sharpened. It was the service road, not intact, sections blocked, littered with debris, but visible, reachable. The final stretch cost him more than the rest combined. His injured leg nearly failed twice, forcing him to crawl the last incline on hands and knees. When he finally reached the edge of the road, he rolled onto his back and stared upward at the broken ridge where the tower had once stood. The mountain was quiet now, scarred but still. Minutes passed before he heard it, faint at first, then unmistakable. The low thump of rotor blades cutting through morning air. A search helicopter crested the eastern ridge, sweeping low along the damaged road network. Aaron pushed himself upright and staggered into the open, raising both arms despite the pain. The helicopter slowed, turned, hovered. For the first time since the storm began, the mountain was no longer the only force deciding what happened next. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.